Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to our panel, Myth, Race, and the Media, sponsored by Baylor in Washington. We've got a terrific set of panelists here for you to view today. I'm David Corey. I'm the director of Baylor in Washington, D.C. I'm also a professor of political philosophy at Baylor University. And I want to introduce the panelists, but before I do, I just want to say a word of thanks. This panel wouldn't be possible without an endowed lectureship sponsored by Robert and Barbara Witten, an endowed lectureship on faith and public life, and that's through the religion department at Baylor University, and we're partnering with the religion department to put this event on, and we're really grateful for the Wittens because this wouldn't be possible without them. They've been a tremendous asset to Baylor and to Baylor in Washington and to the religion program, and they're very deeply concerned about issues at the intersection of faith and public life, religion and public life, and that's exactly where we are at Baylor in Washington as well. Folks who have followed us will know that we have students in Washington, D.C. every semester, but we also put on a number of events every year. And these are events that are right at the intersection of our faith and our public culture. We try to find events where Christians really have something, Christians and other people of faith would have something original and constructive to say. This often means that the events that we host are on sensitive social topics, but we don't shy away from that. In fact, we jump right in. We think that often in these cases, Christianity or religion in general has something special and distinctive to say on some issues. And I think the issue of race in the United States is exactly one of these issues where we want to weigh in and try to be constructive and charitable. I want to say that we have a way of doing things at Baylor in Washington. Those of you who watch us frequently will know, but we take these issues and we really want to hear, it's very important to us to hear from different perspectives and to try to reach some kind of understanding and to get as many people to weigh in and contribute to our understanding of these fraught issues as we can. And so we're not only talking about sociological, demographic perspectives, but also ideological perspectives on the right and the left. And we try to put people in conversation. And one of the ways that we think we can lead with our Christianity is that while we're discussing, even if we disagree, we try to be charitable towards each other and to demonstrate a kind of a civic discourse. So I think that's really important. We'll try to demonstrate that for you on this particular issue. I want to introduce the panelists, and this is a two-panel event. The first is today, obviously, and then the second is Thursday at 8 p.m. Central Time. And the way we've worked on it, we've all worked together on this as a panel, and we've got a kind of a narrative arc. And so we really want to encourage you to participate on both panels if you can make it, because what we're doing here is trying to get at the problem of racism in America through the lens of the media. As best we can try to articulate that problem for you today. But then we don't want to leave it at criticism. On Thursday, we want to turn our attention to where we go from here. What can we do to be constructive? What are ways forward? We'll be joined on Thursday by another panelist, George Yancey, who won't be on this panel, but he will be on that panel. He's a sociologist at Baylor, and he's affiliated with the Institute for Studies of Religion. He's on a blog at Patheos. That some of you will know. It's called Shattering Paradigms, and I can recommend that. That'll be Thursday. The panel today, I want to introduce Mia Moody-Ramirez, who's my colleague at Baylor. She chairs the journalism department, and one of her areas of expertise is race and media. And so we're very happy to have her join us. We also have Professor Greg Garrett from the English department. He does creative writing, but he also focuses on religion and culture. And he's got a new book out that I commend, A Long, Long Way, Hollywood's Unfinished Journey from Racism to Reconciliation. Again, I commend the book. Thank you for joining us, Greg. So glad you could make it. We're also lucky to have Vann Newkirk from The Atlantic. And he's also the host of the famous podcast, Floodlines. If you don't know Floodlines, you've got to listen to Floodlines. We've been talking about it just before starting up here. And then we're so grateful that we can be joined by Korva Coleman, who's going to be our moderator. Folks, you'll know her from NPR, from Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. So those are the panelists. The topic is Myth, Race, and the Media, from Pandemic to Protests. I'd like to turn it over to Korva to start the panel. Thank you all so much for participating.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you and the other members of Baylor University, as well as Mr. Vann Newkirk, in this very timely and unfortunately necessary conversation. David, may I at the outset add my thanks to yours as well, to Robert and Barbara Whitten, whose endowed lecture series on faith and public life has completely made this panel possible. So I would like to thank Robert and Barbara Whitten for making this afternoon, as well as tomorrow afternoon, actually evening, possible. And as you've pointed out, this is only part one of a two-part conversation. So as we get started, I'd like to talk to Greg Garrett, my old friend. Hello, Greg.
Hey, Korva.
I'd like to talk to Mr. Vann Newkirk, senior editor at The Atlantic, whose podcast Floodlines, again, I do commend to everyone. And we're going to talk to Vann shortly about Floodlines and what he revealed in his reporting. And Dr. Mia Moody-Ramirez, professor and chair of the Journalism, Public Relations, and New Media Department at Baylor. Hi, Mia. How are you? The first thing I'd like to do is actually begin with what we're talking about. And the first thing that I want to talk about is mythology. What is mythology? I think we know what it is, but I actually took a moment and went and looked up the definition in Merriam-Webster. And Merriam-Webster defines mythology in two main ways. One, it's an allegorical narrative. Two, it is a popular belief or assumption that has grown up or grown around something. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about myth and mythology. So Greg, I'm batting to you first. You do have a concept of mythologies. What are some popular mythologies that we believe about race and ethnicity?
Oh, well, thank you, Korva. And I love the way that you sort of launched us into this definition of mythology, because one of the important things that we have to recognize is that mythology is not some sort of false Greek story about where spiders come from, but it's a way that we all have of understanding who we are and where we are and what we believe. And, you know, particularly in terms of our conversation today and on Thursday, it's really important for us to understand that over the last 400 years, there are dozens of white racial mythologies that have been launched about where white people want to see themselves and where they want to understand people of color. And so the two that I would want to sort of step into out of the dozens of things that have been sort of perpetrated over the years, the two things that I think speak very strongly into our present moment. The first is a mythology of Black bodies as powerful and potentially violent. And this is something that goes back to the very beginning of slavery in America, but it's something that has continued to be expressed in different sort of popular culture and other myths over the years. In my book about film, I wrote a lot about Birth of a Nation. And most of the Black characters in that film are dangerous in the eyes of the white characters. And so one of the mythologies that we have about race in America is that Black bodies are potentially violent and that they have to be watched over very closely, and potentially violence has to be applied to them to keep them in their place. And then the second one is, it's expressed in terms that are a little bit more endearing. Oftentimes it's expressed as something like, they're like children. But the idea is that people of color and Black people particularly cannot govern themselves. They should not govern others. And whether it was from pulpits in early America or from political podiums or in pseudoscience, there was an idea expressed during the 19th century that kind of continues to the present day, that it's important for white people to keep a close check on Black people to make sure that they are in the place where they ought to be. And this was an expression during slavery, which was to say, the proper place for Black people is under the supervision of white people. But when we take the idea of Black bodies as potentially violent and the idea that white people are supposed to keep a close eye on Black people, then there is a lot of intersection when we look at how law enforcement and the justice system might work in terms of people of color today.
Mia, I know you've written extensively about this. Can you add on to what Greg is talking about here? Mia, are you with us?
You're muted.
Oh, sorry, I'm muted.
No.
I would like to piggyback on what Greg said. The white savior mythology is another one that's popular. It's in the movie The Blind Side and also The Help. And this is the idea that Black people can't succeed unless they have a white person intervene and help them. So yes, these are definitely ideas that are passed down from generation to generation. And then they're also perpetuated in media messages until they just become a regular part of our lives and people believe them to be true.
Vann, I know you've written about this. It's a constant thread throughout your professional life's work of reporting. You've done a lot about this very concept in your most recent work, Floodlines. But can you speak a little bit more broadly about mythology, race, and ethnicity, please?
Yeah, I really think we should start thinking about the story of race itself in America as a mythology. The idea that there are enduring physical, metaphysical, spiritual, sociological differences between races, that they correspond somehow to skin color, to some type of lineage, to where people come from, to the continent where your ancestors were born. That itself is one of the founding myths of America. The idea that we are going to build a society in which resources are allocated, in which freedom is allocated on the basis of some stamp. This is Ibram Kendi's language, stamp from the beginning. The idea that there are things that are going to mark entire ancestral lineages of people for hundreds of years and will dictate where they are able to go in society. Those are all based on myths. And just like Mia and Greg were saying, we have these pieces of that myth that come down through the idea that say Black people are more violent, or the more paternalistic myths that Black people are here to be led, or in the Christian evangelical language that they are here to be led to God. These are all things that emanate from the ultimate, one of the founding myths of America, which is the fact that we are different at some level beyond phenotype. And that is, I think right now, the moment America is having is one where people are doing some rethinking, some reorganizing of their minds in terms of not just, thinking about the sort of distal effects of racism, but where racism comes from. And it's from our understanding of race.
Part of this too also comes from a historical understanding of the New Testament. It says very specifically, slaves, obey your masters. It couldn't get any more clearer than that. And frequently slaves were lectured that they should take joy in their servitude, in their enslavement, because this was the divine way of things. Greg, can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm really drawn to, there are, of course, a lot of different narratives in the New Testament, and different gospel writers and the Apostle Paul are trying to figure out how this new way of seeing the world and being in the world might fit against like the overwhelming political ideology of the day in the Roman Empire. And so in some of the ways of thinking about slavery, they're saying, let's think more about individual salvation than we think about the system. But one of the things that I am really drawn to is that in a recent book, the great New Testament scholar N.T. Wright wrote about the tiny epistle of Philemon, in which Paul writes a slave owner about his escaped slave. And, elsewhere in Paul, we find this wisdom that in Jesus, there is no black or white. There is no Greek or Gentile. There's no male or female. I mean, there's this sense that Jesus has erased the boundaries. But in the book of Philemon, the epistle to Philemon, what Paul is doing is actually saying, this whole thing about slavery and hierarchy needs to get erased by the power of love. And I know that we think of love as sort of squishy, but Dr. King did not think of love as squishy. He thought of it as the most powerful force in the universe. And what Paul was saying in the letter of Philemon was, we need to find a new way of being in which we erase these distinctions, and whatever legal or artificial mythologies that we've put in place, we insert this new mythology in which Jesus says everybody is a child of God, everybody is equal, and everybody has to be valued.
But Greg, that is not a lesson that's been handed down to a lot of people. We have hundreds of years of servitude, of death and destruction and rape and pillage, and all in the name of doing what's right, and doing what you talked about in terms of one of your first two mythologies, that people who are of a different ethnicity, who are Black, need to be treated as children, and in that they need to be dominated, owned, possessed, directed, and broken if necessary. How is it that the message of love isn't the one that usually got heard?
Well, our friend Kelly Brown Douglas, and Vann and Korva and I have done a number of programs with her at Washington National Cathedral, said something in February, the last time I was out in public and not in my bedroom. And we were doing something on Christianity and history at the National Cathedral back in February. And she said, the slavers introduced the slaves to God, but they didn't introduce the slaves to the actual God. Because, her point, and, she's a feminist, womanist theologian, but she had this very strong sense that God is this liberating figure, the figure that we know from Exodus. And there are actually, I had a conversation with BBC Scotland a couple of weeks ago, where one of my fellow panelists was talking about a slave Bible at the University of Glasgow that took out all of the good stuff, all of the liberating stuff from the Bible, and said, here are the rules that religion can impose on you, and took out all of the ways in which liberation might be possible. And, so Vann has talked about Dr. King's last sermon at Washington National Cathedral, and about this movement into a great time of liberation and a revolution. And basically what the slaves experienced was a very diminished version of the religion that actually over the years has led many people of color, many communities of color, in the direction of liberation and freedom.
Mia, I'd like to turn to the definition of mythology a little bit more vis-a-vis race. How are beliefs about race, beliefs about ethnicity acquired from elsewhere that give rise to racism?
I
Go ahead.
think that they are learned because children are not born racist. So they learn, these mythologies are passed down from generation to generation, and they're also perpetuated by mass media messages. So it's kind of priming and reinforcement. They see the message, get the messages at home, then they are reinforced in mass media messages, and then once again when they go to school and when they go to church. And I would just like to circle back and add to what you all were just talking about with slaves and the masters. I think slaves were also taught small on earth, big in heaven. So these myths, they involve nostalgia, or the idea that the best is yet to come. You will get your reward later. Trouble don't last always. And it also gave slaves the sense of being better than their white masters because they knew something that their masters didn't know. They knew that they had like a direct line to God. And it was just the idea, I'm going to suffer now, but it's going to be worth it in the end because I will go to heaven. But I think, once again, these are all learned. The children aren't born racist, so they learn these the mythologies from their parents, from their surroundings, and from mass media messages.
So Vann, if children are taught this, if these beliefs and myths are perpetuated, who gains and what do they gain by this? I think we all kind of know the answer, but I think it also helps to say it out loud.
I think the function of myth in any society is to give people in power. That is why they exist in lots of cases. So I think the enduring story of race in America is one that exists to uphold, to reify, to continue the power of the white settler power structure that founded it. And you look at how it functions today. Even though we've had several significant political shifts in the last couple centuries, in the last half millennium since enslaved folks were first brought to the shores of this continent, you still see that the way people understand race is always a way that is going to keep people of color in a certain box. It's always one that by the mores of the day is going to create a tiered society. It's one where not just Black folks, one where Latinx folks, one where indigenous people are characterized as sort of genetically inferior. One where if it's bad to be violent, they're cast as violent. One where if it is seen as unmanly to be weak, they are seen as weak. And so I think the myths, while I think that the character and content of them shift with the spirit of the age, their function has always been the same thing.
Greg, can you talk a little bit more about the theme that Vann is laying out here for us, and that about power, why it is necessary to keep it and not share it?
Well, in the letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King talked about how people in power never voluntarily give up their power. And we are in this strange space at this moment. And I've mentioned to a couple of you that I'm in conversation with a bunch of white churches and white organizations that are haunted by George Floyd and are recognizing that in this moment, they can't turn their back on what they're seeing. And Korva, you will remember this a couple of years ago on stage at the National Cathedral, after we had shown Do the Right Thing. You asked those of us on stage to talk about our experience with law enforcement. And you started with me as the lone white person on stage, because you knew that my experience was going to be very different from Vann Newkirk's experience. And Vann, I was thinking about this the other day. I was lying awake thinking about this program. And when I was 16 years old in my small town in Oklahoma, the police raided this party where a bunch of my friends were. And so the two police officers on duty, one came in the front door, one stood at the back door. We all ran out the back door. The police officer at the back door said, "Stop or I'll shoot." And we ran over him.
Wow.
And I mean,
and you lived to tell the tale. And
we lived
oh
to
my
tell
goodness.
the tale.
That's a choice.
Well,
wow.
But I'm a 16-year-old white teenager, and I'm like, you are not going to shoot a white teenager for drinking at a party. And that is the absolute distinction. And Korva, your question, at that time got to this big difference, because, you know, I talked about all of these ridiculous experiences I had with law enforcement, and Vann talked about how he puts his hands at 10 and 2 on the driving, like on the steering wheel, so that he does not get shot. And so I think there's just this very powerful sense in which people at this moment are starting to be willing to overturn some mythologies just because they are seeing them held up to them. And so, like, white people understand what happened to George Floyd would never happen to me. And white people are starting to understand I would never be shot multiple times in the back in front of my children. And as horrifying and horrible as this moment is, it also is this moment in which these mythologies are being held up to the purifying light. And what Dr. King used to call people of good conscience are discovering that they can no longer stop paying attention to these distinctions between the way that we're regarded.
I'm sorry, I just have to ask you this question because, like, did you go to the churches or did they come to you? How did this series of conversations originate? That is incredibly fascinating to me. We don't have to go way down and hit this.
No, like, I will take this tiny, but like, because when I started my book on race in 2016, the distinctions about how people regarded race in America were largely dependent on your race. If you were white, you didn't feel like there was a racial problem. If you were a person of color, you thought there was a racial problem. And then this year, the polling, at least earlier this year, indicated that after George Floyd, there was this very strong sense that, yes, however we understand this, it's not just about personal racism. There is something deeper and underlying involved with this. And so because you and Vann and I and other folks have done a bunch of these programs over the last few years, a bunch of white churches reached out to me, and it's a very strange thing. But they've said, you're a white person and you're concerned about racism, and can you help us understand what our next steps might be? And of course, my next steps are to direct people back to Black lives. But that's been a really fascinating part of this, you know, speaking from my bedroom year, that there are a bunch of white people of good conscience who just simply can't turn their backs on the way things have been.
Just am deeply fascinated by this. However, I want to turn next to Mia. Mia, you've written extensively about race and how it's perceived through the lens of media and how it perpetuates mythology. What are some very broad ways that you see racial mythologies promulgated?
Well, in journalism, we see the idea of color blindness, the idea that race is no longer important. This particularly became apparent after Obama was elected president of the United States. People began to say, well, it's obvious that any Black person who wants to succeed, they should be able to succeed. So we had the idea of bootstrapping. Why can't all Black people pull themselves up and do well? And there are, related to the media, there are 3 different myths. There's a myth of marginality, and this is the idea that people of color are ignored and therefore less significant. The myth of difference. This is the idea in local TV newscasts, people of color are routinely represented differently than white people. And then the third one is the myth of assimilation. And this represents people of color, especially African Americans, as having overcome racism and fully assimilated into American mainstream society.
So I need you to go back. I need you to go back to. I need you to go back to marginality and say more about that.
Okay. And so this is the idea of, if this group, if we can depict them as being marginal, as being different, then we can actually rationalize treating them differently. And this goes back to the period of enslavement, where slave masters They saw Black people as being not fully human. And so if we can say that they're not human, then we can rationalize and we can treat them differently. So that's the myth of marginality.
Does that
the idea
persist?
that, yes, it still persists today.
Say more about its persistence.
Today we see where Black people are depicted as being criminal in nature, as being less intelligent, more likely to abuse people or hurt different groups. So it goes back to what I think Greg was saying, the idea of Black people being brute in nature, particularly Black men. So if you buy into this myth of marginality, then you can actually rationalize and say that it's okay, that police brutality is okay. When an African-American man is shot by a police officer for no other reason than the color of his skin, if you buy into the myth of marginality, you will say that it's okay because Black people are less important. So that's how it still persists.
Tell me about difference.
Difference.
The myth of difference.
Okay, the myth of difference. That's how the idea that Blacks are portrayed differently than white people, or people of color are portrayed differently. They are usually seen as being more deviant. We go into some of those stereotypes that have been passed down from generation to generation, that people of color are lazy, they lack intelligence, they live off the system. White people, on the other hand, are more intelligent, more likely to do well. So that's the myth of difference, where you depict whites and Blacks in a different light. And if you buy into that, then you're going to, of course, be less supportive of people of color because you see them as not trying as hard. And so they're deserving of their circumstances.
And that's usually when someone tells me how articulate I still am. And then the third myth of assimilation. Can you speak at length about that?
Yes, so that's the idea that we have fully assimilated into mainstream society. People of color have fully assimilated, and it particularly focuses on African Americans. The idea that they have overcome racism, they have arrived, so all Black people should be successful. And so it goes back to that idea where I just said, if you're not successful, then there has to be something wrong with you. Because you've been given all of the opportunities, you're an American citizen, you're fully assimilated into society, so why aren't you doing well? And if you're not doing well, then there is something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Vann, so we have whole groups of people under these three myths that Mia has just laid out who are not doing well. So if the myth were true, which it is not, then it would mean that there was something fundamentally flawed in the human nature of being a person of color, in being a Black person. That's not true, and yet this myth persists. Can you speak on this?
A lot of myths persist despite being untrue. And I think it will do to sort of interrogate why that is so. There are people in this world who believe the earth is flat. And if there are people who cannot be convinced of the very geometric, fundamental aspects of our planet, there are going to be people who believe that people of color are inferior. But, you know, it does behoove us to really think through why, beyond just the baseline weirdness of human psyche and human intellect, why these things persist. And to me, it goes back to the question about power. It persists because it provides an explanation for why police put their knees on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It provides an explanation for why even now, why people are out in the streets. It's not one, for people who don't want to see those people out in the streets, the explanation is, okay, these people are violent malcontents. who want to overthrow the police that are providing us safety. It provides an explanation for everything, for why the pandemic that we're living through seems to affect Black, brown, indigenous communities at much higher and more deadly rates than it does well-off white communities. It provides an easy shorthand for people who don't want to be challenged in their worldview, for people who benefit from that worldview, for people who like to have their kids in cloistered schools in well-off neighborhoods. It provides a way to say, okay, I'm in the right because those people don't belong here, because they are inferior to us, because their children are going to be loud and are going to be disruptive and going to be violent. Of course, I don't want my kids around them. And so all of these things, the myths of difference, of inferiority, of our inability to assimilate, they create a structure, a shorthand by which people who do not wish to change can maintain the sameness.
So let's stick with that for a minute, because I think sometimes in our minds we have a caricature, an idea of who we think that person in our mind is kind of like. They're probably only one political affiliation. They're only interested in one presidential candidate. They only want to live in one sort of area. They only listen to one kind of music. But I think what you're describing is something that could fit a lot more people who don't fall into those categories.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, honestly, the endurance of certain stereotypes always amuses me, just in the face of so much evidence against them. So the idea that there are certain types of music or culture that people of certain races engage in predominantly, it's just so blown away. If you go on TV and look at who's making a lot of the country music smash hits now, you got some Black folks up there. You go and you look at all the different things that are entering the charts in terms of music. You go and look at the people who are making it in now and becoming the principal dancers at ballet and theaters. Like, the time for those myths, those ways of understanding, those stereotypes would have objectively fallen away decades ago. Still, they persist. And so I think that fact is a testament to their necessity beyond their ability to reasonably sort of explain the world around people. Because right now they exist as a way to indulge in fantasy, a fantasy that will inevitably leave people of color behind while offering moral cover to people who don't want to be seen as racist, of course, but who still wish to leave those people behind all the same.
Mia, what is the evolving role of new journalism when it comes to myths and race? And is there anything that comes to mind for you as an example?
Well, we had great hope when the internet came out or became popular. We thought, oh, now this is going to level the playing field. We're going to see some new narratives and we're going to do away with all of those old narratives. And that's true to a certain extent because we have Black Twitter where people are sharing different messages. I've actually written extensively on Black Twitter. So on Black Twitter, you can see some different messages such as the hashtag, if they gun me down. So that's the idea. If they gun me down and I'm a Black person, which photo are they going to show? Are they going to show the one of me in my graduation gown? Or are they going to show the one of me where I'm holding a 6-pack of beer in my hand? So that's we are seeing some different narratives on Black Twitter and on social media. However, on the other hand, we are seeing more hate-filled messages on social media platforms. When President Obama was in office, we saw him depicted as being criminalistic, as being animalistic. We saw images of him with gold teeth, drinking grape Kool-Aid and eating fried chicken. We saw Michelle Obama depicted as being the angry Black woman. We saw her depicted as being masculine. So whereas we thought that this would level the playing field and we began to see more positive messages of people of color, it's kind of been a double-edged sword. We're seeing both positive and negative, and it's actually been a breeding ground for hate groups because they're able to share their messages anonymously without that gatekeeper in place to moderate the messages that they're sending out. So in the old days, if you wanted to share a message, you had to go through a newspaper or through broadcast medium. But now you're able to share those messages on your own. So we are seeing more hate-filled messages, but we are seeing some other types of messages as well.
Greg, are you seeing, as you lecture and speak with different groups of people, an increase in both of these, positivity as well as messages of hatred?
Yeah, I think one of the things about new media, and especially about social media, is that the anonymity of it makes it possible for people to have exchanges that they wouldn't have face-to-face. So I'm teaching totally online this semester, which is a very strange dynamic for me. 31 years in at Baylor, and my favorite part of every class has been to come in 5 or 6 minutes early and shake hands with people and touch people on the shoulder and find out how they're doing. And we don't have that same kind of connectivity at this moment. And so like when I write something and put my name on it for the Washington Post or the Spectator or Fox News, I am taking responsibility for it. And in social media, there's a chance for people to throw something out that can completely blow up. It is irresponsible in terms of its social value, its political value, its divisiveness. And we have known this for a while, but the other thing, and Mia and Vann, I'm sure could actually talk more about this, but we're also dealing with, at least in this election season, with all of these divisive messages that are being brought in by what we would think of as outside agitators. Mm-hmm. We've got foreign governments that are pushing messages at this time because it is good for them and for their systems if American democracy falls apart. So it is a very strange time. I am an old journalist. I write for magazines and newspapers, but we've got all of these different kinds of dissemination that are going on now, where people can get incredible visibility and conspiracy theories can spread like wildfire, and there's no accountability to it.
I'm thinking most specifically about the latest revelation that Russia has specifically created fake news web pages and employed young journalists from around the world to write news articles that were demeaning of the Democratic presidential candidate. And it was done with a specific purpose in mind, to cause dissension, sow chaos, and create fear. And to that end, some young American journalists were hired, not knowing, of course, who they were working for. But the point being is that if this is happening, what role do social media platforms, and maybe this is a question for Mia, have in either policing or helping stop fictitious and harmful messages, especially ones that are intended to stoke racial hatred?
Well, we saw misinformation regarding COVID-19 successfully taken down very quickly, but we don't see hate speech taken down as quickly. We actually saw, like with COVID-19, we saw different news outlets come together, collaborate, and say, we're going to take down these messages that contain misinformation, because this can be hurtful. If people try to use a certain medical treatment, or if they buy into this misinformation, it can be harmful. So we know that they can actually take down messages when they want to. However, we've seen with political messages and messages of hate, they are slower to take down those messages, or they keep them. They don't take them down at all. So that's one thing that I've actually talked with my students about, because we know that they have the capability. With social media, it's up to citizens to do the policing. So it's up to citizens to, if they see something, it's up to them to report it. And then after they report it, then it's up to the platform to actually take it down. And so that's one thing that I've noticed, that they're not as quick to take down messages of hate speech.
Vann, you're a new media man. What is the role of platforms and of users?
Well, I'd say I'm a mix, because I mean, I'm an editor for the Atlantic magazine, so that's like the oldest.
Yeah.
But I think right now we're kind of figuring out what the role of the platform is. For a long time, we like to believe that platforms themselves could be neutral, that if they said they were neutral, they were. But I think at this point, we have to consider that platforms, as much as publishers, inject some form of bias into the conversation. And that's just how it is. There is no way that Facebook, Twitter, that even Pinterest are not injecting some form of bias on information. Just like Mia says, content moderation is a form of bias in itself. The ease by which certain content is moderated and other content is not is part of that bias. And so the last two elections, we've really got a chance to see a glimpse of the future, I believe, in how platforms are going to more and more shape the actual content of the information that we are receiving, what gets past our filters, what gets into our brains. And the track record right now is not so promising.
I'd like to take a moment here to talk a little bit about your magnificent reporting project, Floodlines, which you did with the Atlantic. This was about the disaster that was caused when the levees failed in New Orleans. A lot of people think of it as Hurricane Katrina, but you go to great lengths over 8 episodes to show us, to reveal to us what really happened. And that was the levees were faulty and people suffered. What came out of that reporting at that time, and I will certainly take my share of responsibility for what you identified, was not a picture of people who were suffering because of flooding engulfing New Orleans, but a picture of people who were, just as you mentioned and Mia has mentioned and Greg has described, people who were violent, people who were looters, people who were rapists, people who were thugs, people who were murderers, people who were not deserving in any way of any kind of help. Mm-hmm. Good riddance. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you discovered in the media portrayal of the people who were victims of the levee breaches?
I'd say in this conversation on myths that the media coverage of the aftermath of Katrina, of the flood, of the day the levees broke, is maybe a prime example of how the American myths about race, how they overpower common sense, how they overpower real good reporting on the ground, and how they can shape the way that Americans writ large respond to crises. So, like you said, right after the flooding began, you saw a proliferation of reports about how people were looting constantly, about all the crime in the streets. You saw all these reports about gunfights between gangs in the convention center, about people gunning down police officers. And it turns out that almost none of these reports were corroborated, that all of the most extreme incidents of violence that were commonly used by people talking about New Orleans after Katrina, almost all of them were either exaggerated or simply plucked from thin air. A lot of the reports about looting were based on, sort of this obsession with a couple of images of people coming in and out of stores. And what all that did was to move the conversation away from how do we actually rescue these people?
Mm-hmm.
How do we get food to them? What should our response be? How do we make sure they have, safe housing in the long term? And then move the conversation from that to whether we should do any of those things at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a powerful reframing in a city that is known as one of the Black cities in America. Whether we should even help this place rebuild at all, whether the average American owes a duty to the victims of the flood, that I think was, I thought that I understood it, how it all worked before I started reporting it out. But for me, just doing the reporting on people who were affected, just talking to them about how they were watching, people who had been flooded, who were watching the TV while they were waiting to be rescued, and seeing the extraordinary dissonance between what they saw in the news reports about people basically calling them savages, mm-hmm. and what they were actually living, how they were coming together, 30 people in a home, doing what they could to save each other, how there were just, every day, dozens and dozens of incidents of just regular people being heroes and sacrificing themselves for other people. How those two, we call them parallel universes, because while there was one real world, the one created by the media and the mythology became so real to people that it didn't really matter what was factually true. It mattered what people believed. And I think even now, 15 years after the fact, even after all the AP reporting on who was called looting and who was surviving, even after all that, people still believe a little bit of the narrative that people in New Orleans, people in the Gulf Coast were somehow uniquely deficient or were responsible for the catastrophe themselves that happened after the flood.
Mm-hmm. Just like you said, fast forward 15 years, it's 2020. What parallels do you see from what you discovered in your reporting to what we see in society today?
Oh, I don't like to make too clean of comparisons between historical events. But that said, I think there are real good parallels between Katrina and between the protests for defunding, abolishing police, and the pandemic. You look at how America responded in the early months of COVID-19, when it was clear that the people who were dying from it weren't necessarily, well-off white folks who were considered to be economically valuable, in a sense. When the hot spots were nursing homes, were elderly people who we already kind of cast off. When the hot spots were in the American South, when they were in Black and Latinx neighborhoods in New York, when it was considered the Chinese virus. All these ways they activated our latent mythology, our way of understanding who was valuable and who isn't. And they definitely colored how we responded from not just, everybody likes to lay all the blame at the federal government's feet. And I mean, there's a lot of blame to be placed, but it colored how state governments responded. It colored how city governments, how quickly they were able to move. It even, I think it dictated how hospital systems managed their resources. And it was all based on this idea of who was worthy of saving or not. You look at the same thing in protests over police violence. There is the reason I believe they continue, and one of the lines of pushback that always happens is this process by which people assess if the victim was actually a victim or if they were deserving of dying. If somehow a petty crime or an inability or unwillingness to follow police directions made them worthy. of a gruesome death or incident of brutality. So we have this same need to put people into the buckets of whether I should care for them or not, whether I should have empathy for them or not, and whether I shouldn't. And to me, race, I mean, along with gender, along with sexual orientation and ability, those things are the ways by which the standard American places people into those buckets of whether I should care about them or not.
We've got about a half hour left, and we've gotten numerous questions from the audience, and so I'd like to turn to a few of them. From Tara, Greg, do you have thoughts on the need for more faith-based witnessing whiteness groups being brought to churches virtually via folks, say, YWCAs?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Okay, I think maybe if I read it again, thoughts on the need for more faith-based witnessing groups about whiteness that are being brought to churches, perhaps through different Christian religious groups, I think might be basically your work writ large.
Yeah, let me speak into that. One of the things that's been really kind of startling for me, and Korva and Vann and I have done this work with Kelly Brown Douglas, who's one of the great African-American theologians. And one of the reasons that we kind of came together to do this around film was the idea that we needed a story to kind of speak into conversation. Like, I think the way that Kelly put it last week when I talked with her was, how can we begin to engage people with this conversation on race? Because nobody wanted to talk about it. It's like, you know, it's your Thanksgiving dinner where it's you and your crazy Uncle Phil and all of these people. And it's like, if you start from your operating place, then it's not going to go well. Like by the time you get past the cranberry, it's going to be painful for everybody. And one of the things that we've discovered in our work together is that, you know, story is a way into this. But as I was mentioning earlier, in the 4 years that I've been working on racial mythologies in film, we have come to this place where, because of George Floyd and because of Minneapolis, there is more of an interest in speaking about this without necessarily taking these, like, you know, tertiary steps. So here is what I would say about the Christian witness and about white Christians and about their place. And I'm actually going to pull a book off my shelf. There's a great new book by the Christian sociologist Robert Jones called White Too Long, which is taking a look at the different ways that over the last 400 years, the white church in America has been complicit in racism. And I think one of the things that Christians of good conscience, white Christians of good conscience, are finally willing to have some conversations is that there are so many ways that we have embraced these myths about race, you know, that Vann has talked about, that Mia has talked about, and we have ignored the myth of what Jesus represents. And so if Jesus is about liberation, if in, you know, the Black church tradition, it's about Exodus and about finding the promised land and it's about freedom, where can we come to this place where we are able to fully embrace our identities as people of faith? And that is the conversation I've been having with a lot of people. I've got another one with a church in Fort Worth tomorrow night, where they are trying to figure out, how do we live into repairing the damage that Christianity has caused, at least in terms of the white church, over the last 400 years. And so I'm not sure that this actually addresses the question of your questioner, but like my experience over the last 4 or 5 months here in my bedroom is that there are a lot of white Christians who can no longer continue to ignore the damage that Christianity has done. And I see this in institutions as well. I wrote in my book about Georgetown. There was a great press release from the University of South this week as they repented of their slaveholding past. And Mia and I are at Baylor, which is one of the great sort of antebellum institutions west of the Mississippi River. And we are interrogating our own history, Christian history, in relation to race. And so my hope is that instead of excluding, which is what Southern Baptists and Southern Presbyterians and Southern Methodists and all sorts of groups did around the time of the Civil War, that this might be a time where people say, this is our calling. Like, we are called to live into an understanding of what Jesus calls us to. And, you know, so I am surprisingly hopeful. 4 years ago, when I started my book, I did not feel this way. And, you know, of course, you know, things ebb and flow in our culture. And after November, who knows where we'll be. But it does feel like a whole lot of white Christians are reaching out to try and understand, how can I understand Black lives? How can I understand where we have failed? How can I understand what we should do moving forward?
Thanks, Greg. Mia, how do we talk to people who are watching what's going on in our society? This is a question from Adriana. How do we talk to people who are watching but are still unwilling to see the distinctions between how police respond to white suspects or Black or other people of color who are suspects? They're watching the same videos I'm watching, but they aren't having the same takeaways.
It becomes very difficult because you still have people out there who say that systemic racism is a myth. Systemic racism doesn't exist. I think you have to just remain steadfast. You have to hope that in seeing the examples repeatedly, now we're making progress, I think, because people are recording these incidents and they are sharing them on social media platforms. And I think we've made more progress since George Floyd's death than we've made in the last couple of decades. I would consider that a watershed moment where we've had people take down Confederate statues and monuments. We've had companies reconsider the branding of their products as they relate to race. The AP style book, which we, Korva and Vann, we use in journalism, they now mandate that when you refer to Black people, you capitalize the letter B. All of this has happened in the last few months since the death of George Floyd. So I would just tell, is it Christiana? Just Adriana, not to give up, remain steadfast, keep sharing the message. You know, don't shy away, because a lot of what we're seeing is what I would term victim blaming. And that's the idea of blaming the victim. So we see victim blaming. We saw it in the 80s with AIDS victims. We see it with rape victims, women who are raped, they're blamed because of how they dress. And of course, we're seeing it with police brutality, where people are blamed because maybe they were wearing a hoodie or maybe they were talking back. So because they're doing these things, they're deserving of dying. And that's something that we see a lot, but I do think we are making progress. So I would say keep sharing those messages, remain steadfast, participate in demonstrations if that's what you like to do, write about it, take photos, just document what's going on right now, continue to document it. And I do believe that we are making progress right now. I'm very hopeful.
Yeah, can I add to that, Korva?
Absolutely, go. Yes.
I mean, I do think that it's easy sometimes to get caught up in the notion that you have to convince most people or all people of the truth, of the rightness of a cause, in order to have the sort of sweeping societal effects that people want. I don't know if historically if that's true. You think about the abolitionist movement against slavery in the 1800s. They never convinced half of Americans that their cause was just and true. That the people who ended up being in the right, the abolitionists who wanted to provide a full range of civil rights to Black people, oh, they were not close to capturing the majority of the American imagination. So you have to think about what good the truth does in itself. Whether, let's set aside the possibility of large systemic changes, the type of things that Mia's already talking about. What if telling the truth or encouraging or checking your friends or being critical in your institutions about race and inclusion, about their myths about race? What if it means that there's one more teacher in the world who doesn't reach to suspend Black children as quickly as he or she used to? What if it means there's, one or two bankers who is a little bit more scrupulous about how they're administering loans and about who they're approving and not denying? That's the difference. That's a life. That's a couple lives changed. And on a larger scale, again, social movements have never needed to capture the majority of Americans to be successful. And so I think right now you're seeing changes that are happening with the majority of Americans appearing to believe that Black Lives Matter is a worthy cause. That's a threshold that, I don't even know if the civil rights movement reached until well into its maturity. So, I think the goal of getting to everybody is a necessary one, because the truth is the truth. But that shouldn't be I say, don't let perfect get in the way of good and right here.
I'm remembering, I believe I read it in Taylor Branch's biography of the civil rights movement and talking about Dr. King, that a Gallup poll was taken in 1962, and people were asked, do you support the goals of integration as advanced by Dr. King? And maybe 20% of people who were white respondents agreed. And I was just completely startled by that. And the reason I'm startled is because if I had a nickel for every time someone has said to me, if only we had someone like Dr. King with us today, then things would be different. And I'm not sure if they're referring to the fact that he spoke in the cadence that he did, or because he wore a tie when he was arrested. He still ended up dead. And that's the thing that people seem to conveniently forget. And he was reviled by many. And I'm not sure where that thinking aligns with what people perceive as the real crises going on today. And if people would be willing to take a risk and align themselves with something that maybe they will 50 years from now, when Colin Kaepernick perhaps comes out on a US postal stamp. I'm sorry, Greg, you're waving your hand.
Yeah, Korva, let me jump in. When I was working on this book, I did a bunch of research at the LBJ Presidential Library here in Austin. And some of our listeners will know that in 1968, before he died, Dr. King was planning another march on Washington. And I had the chance to review the correspondence that people from across America were sending to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it was so illustrative of where we are at this moment. They talked about mobs, they talked about violence, they talked about disorder. They called Dr. King the most dangerous man in America. And so sort of following up on this desire that people have to follow our civil rights saint into battle, there is still this like incredibly powerful stereotype, mythological type that when a bunch of people of color begin to march, it becomes so frightening for the people in power. And so all of this sort of coded language of mobs and violence and crime and law and order is still an incredible part of our discourse. And, you know, Dr. King died 50 years ago. And his cause is still like moving forward. We have not achieved the things that he had in mind.
So to this group, a question from Jillian. As a mother, I hold myself accountable to ensure my children recognize their privilege and acknowledge the beauty and value of their friends and community. I've looked hard at my own prejudice that I can now acknowledge existed in my upbringing. What advice or tools can you recommend to help bring up the next generation? Floor is open.
You know, I've gotten a lot of questions like this summer. I think the response, the easy response among a lot of people is to like do, you know, a little. People love doing syllabi, putting a good reading list together. You know, and they're often the sort of like same kind of like anti-racist or really intellectual exercises understanding this. And I think those are good resources. But for me, the instinct is more or less, it's a little bit more lowbrow. It's the best way to me, the missing thing here is empathy. And that is the best way to overcome a lot of the myths we're talking about, is just being able to have a sense that people are people, and this is how I treat people. And the easiest way to do that is to actually be with people, to watch the things that Black people are watching, to listen to the radio that people of color are listening to be in the same spaces as them, to engage in community with them, to, you know, be at church, put some money in the plate at Black churches. It's to me, that is the most powerful way. You know, I'm not saying like people go in and put a dashiki on and like, you know, pull up and perform, but just being in purposeful community, meaningful community, being hospitable to people. You know, I like to ask white folks if they have cooked for a Black person ever. And there's a surprisingly low response rate on that one.
Yeah.
And there's no amount of reading, you know, James Baldwin and Bell Hooks that's going to get you there. It's just that's the thing is engaging and building the basic sort of things of community that we have with the people we're comfortable with.
I agree with Vann. The first thing is to acknowledge your biases and then try to practice empathy, as Vann said. Try to see things from other people's viewpoints. And I write a lot about cultural appropriation and Halloween costumes. One of the things that I tell people, if you think your costume, if you're not sure if it's going to offend people, think about if the person that you're dressed up as, if you knock on the door of a Black person, how would that person feel? Or if you're dressed up like a Hispanic person and you knock on their door, how would they feel? And so usually if you can answer they would feel uncomfortable, then you shouldn't wear that Halloween costume. So I do think empathy is very important. If you can just walk a mile in someone else's shoes, that will take you a long way in making improvements. And then what I tell journalism students is the first step, once again, is to acknowledge that you have these biases. And once you've acknowledged them, then you can try to work against them. When you're trying to be objective in your storytelling, make sure you interview people who have different beliefs. You try to interview as many people as you can or that you have time for, people with different viewpoints. Those are some of the ways that you can kind of overcome this, or if you can't overcome these things that you bring to the table, but you can work with them and kind of counteract your viewpoints by talking to people from a lot of different backgrounds, as Vann said.
Yeah, and I would just like second and third that, whether we talk about connection or empathy or community. In Jamar Tisby's Color of Compromise, at the end of his book, he talks about different ways that white people can make connections. And it is one thing to read White Fragility or to watch the 5 best films on race, which I have recommended to people. But it is so much more important to ease into Vann's question, which is have you cooked for a Black person? And I knew intellectually for many years that, the way I was treated was different than the way people of color were treated. But to hear Kelly Brown Douglas talk about her fear for her son every time he went out of the house, and Korva, that moment on stage at the National Cathedral, when you asked me about my experience and Vann about his experience, I mean, that broke me. To have the connection.
I don't like
with
to break my questioners.
Well, I didn't do the Barbara Walters weeping on stage, but I looked over at Vann, who I think is one of our greatest writers on race and politics, and who I admire so tremendously. And to think about how my experience and his experience are so different just because of the color of our skin. It is, I think, so powerfully important for white communities, white churches, to connect with people of color and to have those experiences where they can understand in a really powerful and profound and personal way. Because I love Kelly Brown Douglas, to have her tell me that she fears for her son every time he leaves for the house, and to recognize that I have never had that conversation with my boys. I mean, it's a total game changer.
Here's a question that hasn't been posed by one of our audience members, and that is, how do we do this initially? It's not like we're gonna walk up to somebody down the street and hand them a plate of rice or something like that, Vann. Building community requires taking risk, and it requires acting. And sometimes people don't know what to do. So I can say one thing: a lot of people who are white don't know that. Did you know you can join the NAACP? People actually don't know this. They think it's not for them. But the organization is intended to advance civil rights, not only for people who are Black, but for all people of color. This is an organization that has had people who are white on its board of directors. That's actually something I advocate for people. Mia, can you think of other ways in which people can build community in ways that maybe we haven't thought of?
Well, I think it was, someone said that the 10 o'clock hour on Sunday is the most segregated. So church swaps, that would be another way. Maybe have families of one church swap churches with another, so that you could have some diversity in the people going to church. I think that would be a good way. And I've actually participated in a church swap at Baylor. And with that group, we actually went on a civil rights tour, which was awesome. And it was good because it was a very diverse group. And in exposing individuals to, what happened. Like we went to, I think it was, where was the Black, was it Arkansas? Not Arkansas, but Oklahoma, where they had Black Wall Street. It was blown up. So we had
Tulsa.
Tulsa.
Yeah.
People who had not heard anything about that. So they were exposed to that history. So that's another thing, being able to go and visit these areas and see firsthand what has been done historically to kind of keep Black people back. So being able to see it for yourself, I think that's also a step in the right direction.
Van, one of the things I have done as well as a person of color who was raised as a Christian was I went and attended an open house at my local mosque and was warmly received. Got to kneel in prayer with the other women who graciously invited me to kneel and pray with them. And it was a most wondrous afternoon that I had never experienced before. And out of that, I made acquaintances and friends that I otherwise would not have had. But it was a moment of, and as a journalist, we're accustomed to feeling uncomfortable, but there's a moment where you're kind of like, oh, everybody's looking at me. And doing something that's out of the ordinary for ourselves that we might not otherwise have done. Can you speak about that feeling of doing something that might feel out of the ordinary?
Oh yeah, nobody wants to feel out of place, and nobody wants to feel like they are being watched, or that they are. Nobody likes to be a fish out of water, and that's the sort of basic, as a basic function of human, nature and community, right? That's the reason why we have communities. That we build places that are going to feel more comfortable for us. But what you're describing, I think a lot of people kind of forget that the civil rights movement, as we know it, was largely a function of interchurch, interdenominational, and interfaith organizing in a very purposeful way that took lots of people and put them in situations where they're outside of their comfort zone. You look at the Mississippi Freedom Summer, it involved taking a lot of white kids out of the North and putting them in right in the crucible of the, of Jim Crow. And that's how it's always worked, I think. To me, an effective rhetorical device that I like to use for people is, okay, you don't want to go, it is uncomfortable, if you want to go to an event at an HBCU, or if you want to go to your local Black church, or if you want to attend an NAACP meeting, or a local, Black environmental justice organizer. But the counter I like to propose to people is that feeling you have when you show up and everybody's looking at you and you're wondering, do I have everything on right? Am I standing up straight? Am I sounding right? That's kind of how every person of color feels in mixed company when they go to work every day.
Yeah.
If you've never had to be outside of your comfort zone in that way, then you'll never be able to get to the point where you can empathize with those folks.
It's a good point. And I do think it's more than just Black people going to dinner at a white home. You need to have more white people going to dinner at Black homes as well. Because I feel like we're always the ones who are integrating. Like, we're the ones who go to work, or we're the only Black person and everybody else is white. Or we're the ones who integrated school districts, So I think, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie White Like Me, but it's about this white man whose parents, they were professors, they were well off, but they intentionally made him go to school with people of color. And it was a game changer for him. So his whole life, he was able to empathize with people of color just because of that decision that his parents made. So I think that's where you're probably going to see even more progress, when you can have white people that are integrated into communities of color.
Yeah.
We don't have much time, and what I'd like to be able to do is afford each of you an opportunity to give a closing thought. We've discussed a lot, we've taken some questions, but we focused on the idea of mythology vis-a-vis race and ethnicity. And we've talked about how these mythologies are damaging, and yet they persist. The next conversation is going to be about addressing those mythologies. And I'd like each of you, starting with Greg, to talk about some themes that you are foreshadowing now that you hope to take up in the next conversation?
Oh, thank you, Korva. Well, it feels to me like the work I've been doing for the last 4 years in this book on race and film, and the work that I'm starting to do with white communities as they think about where they've been and where they want to go. I look at the ways that film helped us to sort of raise up these mythologies into the light. And so whether we were talking about, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, or whether we're talking about Glory, or whether we're talking about Birth of a Nation, which is, at ground zero of racist mythology in American culture. I think one of the most important things that we can do is to acknowledge and repent of and begin to think about how we move forward from the beliefs that we've held. And that's what I see happening in different institutions. We mentioned Georgia and the University of the South and Baylor and the work that they're doing in their historical, reconciliation work. But what I think about most powerfully is all of the white Christians who have gotten in touch with me to talk about George Floyd, because they know perfectly well that there is no reality, there is no mythology in which their life ends at the knee of a white policeman. And so the shattering kind of realization that is washing over people of goodwill is this understanding that I have been privileged by these mythologies that we have set in place. And I don't want to live in this place of injustice and unfairness anymore. And so the place of hope that I hope that we'll talk about on Thursday night is, what are the ways that we can speak about Black lives and the lives of people of color? What are the ways that we can speak about the many ways that 2020 has put the fault lines in our culture and our system on view? And what are the ways that all of our lives can matter? And that's the world that I want to live in. That's the world that I am working toward. And I mean, thanks be to God, that is the world that I think a lot of white Christians are finally beginning to feel like, I can't continue the way we have done. So that is my hope as we move forward and as we talk about Thursday night. And thank you, Korva, so much for asking that.
Mia.
I think we also need to talk about the importance of literacy and being critical thinkers. As consumers, we must be informed and we must be aware that myths and media messages are goal-driven. Whether it's to sell a product, to sell a person, or an idea, usually they're created to benefit the dominant group. So people need, once they realize that, they need to be aware that it's important to expose themselves to different messages, to different platforms, as we talked about earlier. As I tell my students, I listen to NPR, which I love NPR, by the way, Korva. But I also keep up with what's going on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, because I want to know what everybody is talking about right now. And then once I have this information, it's up to me as the audience to make a rational decision about who's telling the truth and which message is more credible.
Thanks, Mia. Vann, your final thoughts, please.
So I'll get into more of it Thursday, but I think the conversation about mythology and about how we dismantle myths, about how we replace them, we can only do so much in talking to the people who are believing in the myths. We really have to think about, there's a flip side to this, and it's the extent to which the people who are the subject of these myths are able to actually write their own stories, are able to correct the record, are able to create media, create information, are able to be the conduits to truth themselves. And, you know, as much as we talk about people getting out and going and going to HBCUs or being hospitable or building community, none of that matters if we are not nurturing the people who are marginalized in the first place, to be able to own the narrative, to be able to tell their stories. If we're not investing in media that does it, if we're not investing in the storytellers who do that. And I don't mean just, you know, investing in the capital sense. I mean investing our time, investing mentoring, investing professional advice, and providing positions and power to people who are creating those narratives. I think about as a journalist, if you're not interviewing, especially women of color, as a journalist, you know, you're not doing your job in this moment. And so those are all the ways that we create conditions beyond ourselves that allow other people to thrive, flourish, and do the other half of the work, which is creating the truth, which is transmitting the truth. And that's why, you know, I think we still haven't gotten there yet.
Mm-hmm. I agree. But we will get there one day. I think we're making progress. And I think when people look back on this period, back on what's going on now, it will be, as Vann said, it'll be like looking back on the civil rights movement. People who hate the Black Lives Matter movement now, when they look back on it in the future, they will wonder, well, why were people arguing about this? Of course, Black Lives Matter. Of course, we should be against police brutality. So I think, you know, in the future, people will look back on this period and it'll look very different.
And with that, we're going to leave this initial part of the conversation. I'd like to thank my guests, Dr. Mia Moody-Ramirez, Mr. Vann Newkirk, and Dr. Greg Garrett from Baylor University. Mia is also from Baylor University. And this is my opportunity to turn this conversation back over to Mr. David Corey, the director of Baylor in Washington and professor of political philosophy at Baylor. David, are you still with us?
Thank you, Korva.
Thank you, Mia.
Thank you, Korva.
Thank you so much, Korva. I'm with you. I have nothing to add. Thank you so much for a great job and for all your insights on the panel. We're very grateful.
Mm-hmm.
Baylor in Washington has been served well by you and your insights, so thank you so much.
And that concludes everything. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.